the peace process, what's called it's a misnomer. Because the simple fact is that the Arabs cannot deliver peace, in the sense that we understand it. The Middle East lives in a different time zone. It's it's 15th, 16th century Europe, religious war, things like that. So it's not. We'll never have, never maybe is a strong word, but not in the short period of time we'll have a peace like you have with Canada or even with Mexico. Look how they treat each other. Can you imagine that they treat the Jews better than they treat their fellow Arabs? So, this whole notion of having peace with neighbors, of course, it's nice. Everybody wants peace, but it's not practical. And I think Rabin understood that. Rabin did not envision a peace. He was skeptic about the peace with Egypt, which is no people-to-people interactions. It's a peace between two elites, and the deal is simple. You get territory, and we get security. And indeed, at Oslo, Rabin insisted on the Palestinian entity to have a strong police, a strong army, basically. No Supreme Court of Justice, no human rights organizations. He wanted basically a strong dictator to make sure that there are no terrorist attacks against the state of Israel. Similar arrangement we had with Egypt, similar arrangement we have with Jordan. In Jordan, it's a different story. There is a long strategic relationship between the Hashemites and the Zionist movement. And Rabin had no illusions about peace. You mentioned trust. It's ridiculous. People expected trust between Rabin and Arafat. Rabin didn't trust even his defense minister, Shimon Peres. So can he trust? Does he trust Arafat? All those liberal notions are. It's strange. We live in a different area. It's not trust. We probably made a cardinal mistake in believing that the Palestinians want a state. And we assume that having a statist structure will bring them to realpolitik, to understand there are certain interests, and if they bleed too much, they'll change their behavior. This is a very big assumption that the Palestinians really want a state. We wanted a state, and we're ready to compromise for very small territory because we understand the importance of having a state for people without a state. I'm not sure that the Palestinians have the same rationale. And there is no chance for an agreement between us and the Palestinians that will bring some kind of stability for three main reasons. One is there is a serious gap in our positions. They want Jerusalem, for example. They want Jerusalem. I can understand why. A state, without having the capital in Jerusalem, it's probably like a Zimbabwe. No resonance. Jerusalem carries a lot of resonance. This is particularly why we want Jerusalem, not only because of history, because Jerusalem has resonance. The refugees. UNRWA was just, got hit by your president, rightly so. But the refugee issue is a very potent issue in the Palestinian ethos. And, we should not fool ourselves that they will give up this issue, which is part of their identity, part of their victimhood they cherish so much. So those issues cannot be easily solved. And this is why there is no agreement. We can delay it, maybe Trump will offer a deal of the century. He probably believes that money is everything, but there are many people in the world that money is not everything. There are other things which are important. So the gap is too large to bridge. Also, I think this statist assumption is very problematic. Because the Palestinians, even if you offer them a state, they cannot build one. In order to establish a state, you need a certain political culture which is inexistent. And it's not only the Palestinians. Look at the Middle East. Is Yemen a state? Is Iraq a state? Is Somalia a state? Is Libya a state? It seems to me, as an observant of Middle East affairs, that the Arab world has difficulties in sustaining statist structures. Even Egypt, which is probably the only true historic state in the region, has difficulties. What characterizes a state, and I'll give you a short lesson in political science. The Weberian division, Max Weber, a famous political sociologist, German one, he characterized the state as a political entity with monopoly over use of force. There's only one army, no militias. In 48, Jews had militias, and Ben-Gurion said no militias. And he shot at Jews of the Irgun in order to make sure there are no militias. This incident was called the Altalena. The Palestinians never successfully met the Altalena test. We see one militia took over part of the Palestinian territories, Gaza, and not even in Gaza there is monopoly over use of force. It's Islamic Jihad, there are clans, there are other groups with weapons, which is very similar to much of the rest of the Arab world. Because we live in a time, the Middle East lives in a different time zone. Again, I repeat it. So without monopoly over use of force, there is no state. And I don't think that they are able to establish a state. Of course, much money goes into the Palestinian territories, which helps them overcome some of the problems, but no state. It's not a state. And the third reason, which is probably the most important one, is that the two national movements, the Palestinian national movement, which I'm not sure they want a state, the Zionist national movement, we wanted a state, to have a state, still have energies to fight for things that are important to them. We are ready to fight for Jerusalem. I'm ready to go with my gun and to fight for Jerusalem in the streets of Jerusalem if for some reason somebody decides to give up part of the Temple Mount. The same is true of the Palestinians. Take a look at Hamas. They have energies to fight. They are not tired. Since the Palestinians are not a real state, actually what we see is an ethno-religious conflict. In this type of conflicts, and not when an outsider comes with a very nice offer. Reagan, President Trump believes he has a nice offer. Those conflicts end when at least one side is tired. And I don't see any wariness on the Palestinian state, and I'm sure that we are ready to fight, continue to fight for things that are important to us. And this is the main element in the conflict, the readiness to fight. So the Palestinians are basically a strategic nuisance for us. It's not an important enemy. We can live with it. How many Israelis were killed this year by Palestinians? less than 10. You know how many people died in car accidents in Israel? A few hundred. That's a proportion. Actually, we really don't want, to conquer the West Bank or the Palestinian cities. Why should we be responsible for feeding them, taking care of them? The international community is doing a good job. You send money, Europeans send our money. We don't want hungry neighbors, but if somebody else wants to pay for it, fine. The West Bank, Abbas, is sitting on Israeli bayonets. We do care of cleaning the Hamas opposition. We go in almost every night. Some Israeli troops go in, pick up the bad guys, bring them over, put them in jail. We want them alive because then they squeal, we get information. We don't want them dead. Also, funerals are not good for public relations. So, and there is a clear division of work between us and the Palestinians. We speak about coordination. They are we are arresting 2/3 of the bad guys per year, more or less. They are arresting 1/3, and they have a revolving door. They bring them in after a while. Let's free them. They do some good for us. Killing Jews is not so bad in Palestinian ethos. So this is the situation, and we can live with it. Actually, the Israeli society was very successful in routinizing conflict. Routinizing conflict. It becomes a routine. Like car accidents, like theft. Yeah, there are many bad things happening every day to many people. So we put it in proportion. The Palestinians, you have to understand, once they were, a serious agent in international terrorism, no more. Do they have any influence over oil? No. Do they have any influence over nuclear proliferation? Those are serious issues, oil, nuclear proliferation. No. So this adds to our assessment that they are a strategic nuisance, and not more. I will, mention one good thing about Oslo. Oslo, of course, was a failure. And by now, Israeli society can tell itself, we tried. We really tried. We tried to give up territory for peace. It didn't work. This is a lesson. This is a clear lesson for most of the Israeli society, who have no more illusions about the Palestinians. Basically, there is great consensus in Israel. We are ready for territorial concessions. Most of the Israelis are not greater Israel advocates. But at the same time, the same consensus is, we have no partner. This was the lesson of what's called the Second Intifada, the terrorist campaign of year 2000. And we know. We live with it. We live with the problem. Understanding very pragmatically that there is no solution for every problem. Here in the West, you are engineering minded. Every problem must have a solution. It ain't so. Not every problem has a solution. I presume some of you are married here. You live with tension, you live with friction. This is part of life. And the Palestinian friction is bearable. And I think that we should talk about serious issues. Iran. Iran is a problem. Palestinians are not a problem. Are a problem, a small problem. Small disease that follows you and you'll not get rid of it, anytime soon. On this optimistic note, I'll turn over to Daniel.
Point of view. I agree with all of it except for one part, which in fact is your most serious argument, that the Palestinians are not a problem, the Palestinians are a strategic nuisance. Let me just say two words.
Which you've heard from me many years ago.
I heard, yes, we were on a panel together in Sydney. Yep. You said the same thing, and I was very taken by it then. I don't agree with it now. Let me just say two words, Durban and Corbyn. Yeah, they only kill 10 Israelis a year, and that's much less than the traffic accidents, but there is, especially on the left, an anti-Zionist movement that is growing and growing and growing, and unless Israel takes care of this, it could sweep all of Europe. What you see in Sweden now could be the future everywhere, and not just in Europe, and Latin America, and East Asia, and so forth. So don't be so quick to just ignore this and say Iran is the only problem. Of course, Iran is the military problem. Palestinians are not a military problem, but they're a political, diplomatic, economic, and otherwise problem that you just simply can't ignore. They're not a strategic nuisance. They are a strategic threat, existential threat to Israel. But that's not my point. My point is first to thank Sarah and Emmett for inviting me. And my point is to look at it from an American point of view, not Israeli, and to look at Oslo 25 years later, and in particular to look at some of the analyses by those who were involved, either then or later, and to assess them. Now, my point of view, to give it to you first, is that this was a fundamental error on the Israeli part, as symbolized by Yitzhak Rabin saying over and over and over again, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Wrong. You do not make peace with your enemies, you make peace with your former enemies. You first have to defeat them, they first have a sense that the gig is up, the battle is over, and they need to come to terms. So long as they are not defeated, so long as they have energy, as Ephraim correctly pointed out, they're not defeated, and they'll continue to battle. The battlefield has changed. It changed between early and late September 1993. It was a different battlefield. They've been fighting on this different battlefield ever since then, but it was still a battlefield. Nothing fundamentally changed. So that's my point of view. But that's not the point of view of those who are peace processors. It's a way to make a living, right? Just 3 days ago, Dennis Ross and David Makovsky published, if Trump wants the ultimate deal, he must not repeat these mistakes in foreign policy. And they have no less than 15 mistakes. 5 for US, 5 for Israel, and 5 for the Palestinians. Enad Vilf, a very interesting and smart Israeli politician, has one error, which she calls constructive ambiguity. In other words, it was all very fine to agree on a piece of paper that doesn't really tell you what it means, because years later it's a problem. But I'm going to focus not on those two, that we'll be happy to talk a bit later. I want to focus on Joel Singer. Joel Singer is a lawyer in this city. He was Israel's legal advisor. He had a long experience in the IDF as a lawyer for Israel, and he became the legal advisor to the Israeli mission, the Israeli team, and he just published in August in Fathom Journal, is 25 years since Oslo, an insider's account. And in his case, there are 3 main errors that Israel made and 3 main successes. I'd like to go into them in a bit of detail. Errors were, and I'm just quoting his words, 1, trusting Yasser Arafat to be a willing and capable negotiating partner. 2, allowing the PLO to be responsible for internal security for Palestinians. 3, failure to free settlement activity during the autonomy period. Successes of Oslo, again 3. Mutual recognition, opening the door to better relations between Israel and many Arab countries. 3, creating a foundation for future Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. Now, I believe his successes are illusory. He says there's mutual recognition. Excuse me? There's mutual recognition? I don't see it. The PA, we're only talking PA now, not Hamas, the PA, does not recognize Israel. Look at his maps. look at its rhetoric, look at its school books. There's no recognition of Israel. False. 2, opening the door to better relations between Israel and many Arab countries. True, that has happened, but that's not due to Oslo. That's due of late to Iran. The fact that the Obama administration took steps towards Iran, left the Saudis, Emiratis, and others high and dry, so they turned to Israel. Nothing to do with Oslo. 3, creating a foundation for future Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. No, there's no foundation in place of anything. There's more hostility today than there was in August 1993. There's a far more vituperative and toxic environment today than it was 25 years and 2 months ago. But more interesting are the errors. He points to trusting Yasser Arafat as an error. Yeah, well, yeah, it's an error, but it's purely tactical error. Allowing the PLO to be responsible in terms of security. Yeah, an error, but a small error. Failure to free settlement activity. I don't know if that's an error or not. I think there's something useful in putting pressure on the Palestinians, saying, you know, as the years go by, I read that it was 110,000 Israelis in the West Bank in '93, and now it's 460,000. Well, you know, Palestinians, this is what happens. Don't come to the table, don't make peace, don't resolve the problem, but pressure. I would say the real failures are far deeper. First, the fundamental imbalance of land for peace, something substantive, real estate for words. It's a strange notion that has no precedent and no follow-up. Everywhere else in their negotiations, it's equal, land for land, something concrete for something concrete. The Israelis, secondly, gave up deterrence, just as was about to work. In my view, the period 1948 to 1993, a 45-year-long period, saw Israel going from being an embattled nascent state in 1948 to a powerful, not as powerful as today, but still a powerful state in 1993 that had defeated all its Arab state enemies, that was on the cusp of the internet and other revolutions. It was working, deterrence was working, and yet Rabin handed it away, gave away the deterrence in favor of what? In favor of appeasement. Appeasement is the policy where you give something to your enemy in the hopes that he'll give you something back. Appeasement does work. It does work. The British appeased the Americans in the Yukon-Alaska frontier in the 1860s. And guess what? It's still there. But that's Britain and the United States. The British used appeasement with African chieftains and Indian rajas, and it worked. But it didn't work with Hitler, it didn't work with Brezhnev, and it didn't work with Arafat. A little bit of difference. These are ideological enemies, and it didn't work. The Israelis gave up deterrence in 1993 for appeasement. Fundamental error, much bigger than the sort of things that Singer, Ross, Mikovsky, and Wilf are talking about. And most fundamentally, as I said before, you make peace with a former enemy. Your enemy first has to give up before you can make peace. Now, why is this important? It's important because this goes on. There are still peace processors. There are old peace processors and there are new peace processors. And they haven't learned the lesson. They see the mistakes. They go to someone like Ross, who's been in this business for decades. He's a very smart guy and very eloquent, but he fundamentally doesn't see the problem. And they sit at his feet and they learn the lessons from him. Well, you know, things like you got to pay more attention to public opinion. American mistakes that he mentions are Clinton's inconsistency, Bush's hesitancy, Obama's leniency, lack of grassroots peace building, peace as an abstraction. I mean, that's the lessons he has to teach. But they're the wrong lessons. The fundamental lesson that must be established is that so long as the Palestinians want to eliminate the Jewish state, there won't be any peace. Only when they give that up only when they get tired, to use Ephraim's words, will there be a prospect of some resolution. So future peace processes are likely to make the same mistakes as the old ones. As a finale, so that's the importance of this. As a finale, I'd like to conjure up a world in which there was no Oslo, in which those leftists weren't going off to Oslo, in which Rabin kept Paris at a distance, in which It never happened. Where would we be today, 25 years later? I think we'd be a lot better off. There would be no PA in the West Bank. There would be no Hamas in Gaza. There'd probably be no BDS. There'd be certainly no kites and no tunnels. And I would go so far as to say there'd be no Corbyn. Not necessarily he wouldn't be there, but he wouldn't be the leader of a Western hostility to Israel as it is now. The hostility to Israel was far less pre-Oslo than post-Oslo. And it's because of Palestinian surge and anger against Israel that followed Oslo. In other words, Oslo to the Palestinians said, we Israelis are weak, you Palestinians are strong. We're going to give you things unilaterally. We're going to get nothing from you in return. We're going to give you territory. You can have troops. You can have arms. You can have postal codes and telephone codes. And all these things. Because we're weak, we're giving it to you. And the Palestinians said, yeah, you're weak. We're strong. We're going to go after you. And you know what? It worked. In 2000, the Israelis fled Lebanon. In 2005, they fled Gaza. A couple years later, they were close to fleeing the West Bank at moment one. And they got a clear sense of Israeli defeatism, weakness, Palestinian rage, and success. And that Palestinian rage is what has transferred, I'm using him as an example, as a prototype, to Jeremy Corbyn. It's the Palestinian rage. Jeremy Corbyn himself, where does he care about Palestinians, or for that matter, Israel? He's enraged because there is this rage out there, and that rage is due to Oslo. So Oslo was a huge mistake, far beyond the people who were killed, far beyond the economic travails. Oslo has fundamentally shifted the whole environment of the Arab-Israeli, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It can't be undone. But I think if it weren't for Oslo, the Palestinians would be pretty much understanding that they lost. This gave them a second wind that is still in effect. It was a disaster. And I fear that its consequences, whether it be Corbyn or the peace plan that the Trump administration has under wraps, is going to be more of the same. We are still burdened by these terrible mistakes of 25 years ago. And neither the Israelis, the Americans, much less others, are ready to come out from under them and look at this question afresh. So on that pessimistic note, I conclude. Well, as Ephraim pointed out, among Israelis there has been this shift. If you compare Israel with 20 years ago, it's a very different place politically. Otherwise, too. I mean, it's actually one of the big things that I can't understand, perhaps you can explain it, is how in the past 20 years, three huge things have taken place in Israel. One is an increase in the birth rate. Two is abundance of water, though granted it's a little shaky at the moment. And three, an understanding of Israel's political situation, which 20 years ago they didn't get, and now they do. So in Israel, things have much improved, and not just politically. In the United States, they've in fact gotten worse. In the United States, the political lines are not by religion. They are by where you are on the spectrum. Essentially, all conservatives, with a handful of exceptions, are pro-Israel. And essentially, liberals, especially as you go out the spectrum, are cool to hostile to Israel. And the difference is becoming ever more exacerbated. You could see it already in the late 1990s. I started writing about it, I think, in 2001, 2000 or so. But it's really stark now. And I'm glad you acknowledge I'm not a magician. I don't know how to change that. And I think that's part of a worldwide phenomenon, which sees, in effect, Muslims warming to Israel. Granted, many don't, but a lot of important ones do. And the left cooling towards Israel, becoming more hostile. So the left is becoming more of an enemy than the Muslim world. Israel can do business with say Egypt in a way that's easier than with Sweden. I don't think the Israelis should give in to the BDS movement, obviously. I do think it is significant politically. There are new waves of anti-Israel sentiment. I do not think it is significant economically, and that's for a rather subtle reason. As I understand it, 90% of Israeli exports are to businesses, and not fruits and flowers, but components of your Apple machines. So you don't know it, you don't see it, you don't buy it directly. So economically it doesn't make much difference, but politically, it's huge, it's very important. And there have been a variety of Israeli responses to it, good ones, from what I can say, but I don't see that they've had much of an impact. And it is primarily the schools, the universities, the educational institutions that are grinding out anti-Israel advocates. And you hear of all these kids who come from Zionist homes, who become leaders of the anti-Zionist movement. They're angry at Israel. It's this Palestinian anger that was fomented by Oslo.
I want to distinguish between Jews and non-Jews. Jews are a different thing, and it's not the first time we see anti-Zionist Jews, and it's been with us for years, and there are changes over time, and we lose Jews. That's part of our history. About the non-Jewish world, I think I don't want to go into a long lecture, but our situation, Israel's situation, is very good. First of all, there is a large part of the world is non-biblical. China, India, small countries. There are, a lot of people there and say we didn't kill their God. They are totally ignorant of some of the anti-Semitic motifs, and we do very well. So just the opposite. We are considered old civilization, just like them. They are totally pragmatic on the Palestinian issue. Maybe they pay lip service, but business is business, and this is true of most Asians. So they are not affected by the Palestinian issue. We have something to offer, and they buy it. India, I saw an interview. They are buying almost $3 billion military equipment a year from us. It's a lot of money for a country like us. We have a problem in Europe. And I want to tell you, anti-Semitism, I'm sorry to tell you, it's not my problem. It's a European disease, and they have to take care of it. I'm not going to fight anti-Semitism. I've done nothing. Nothing wrong. It's a European malaise, and they have to solve it. And they don't do it, for their own reasons. And we see, with the memory of Holocaust fading away, we see a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe and maybe here. Anti-Israeli positions in the United States also is not something new. I remember in the late 60s, in the 70s, there was a new left. We were students at that time, we remember there were also third world that was against us. So it changed. By the way, I'm looking carefully at the polls of Americans, there is no change in the popularity of Israel in the American public. It's more or less 2/3. Over the years, over the last 2-3 decades. So it's true that the Democrats are going further to the left, and maybe at the universities, the teenagers don't have a good judgment, so they run after propagandists. But basically, our situation in the United States is not so bad. I wish the whole world would be like the United States. And I admit that my sensitivity is very different from the sensitivity of Jews living here. I live in my country. I'm not, I live differently, and I see how well we are doing, and okay, so somebody's shouting there, so I can live with that. It's nothing new. So we have to keep it in perspective. The battle of ideas is very important. I agree. It may affect the legitimacy of Israel. But we are doing okay, and since when were Jews popular? Let's take a look at history. Was the Jews popular? In a period of time. So actually now we are doing very well. Israel is a model for many countries.
I think the key factors were less what you mentioned of Camp David and the '82 war, and more what happened just prior, namely the collapse of the Soviet Union and the defeat of Saddam Hussein. These were two immense blows against Arafat and the PLO. They were weak. They had financial problems, they had legitimacy problems, they had internal fights going on. And out of desperation, Arafat agreed to a step that hitherto would have been anathema, and to go talk to the Israelis. He didn't change his strategy, he changed his tactics. He didn't change his goals, he changed his methods. So instead of trying to eliminate the Jewish state through violence and direct assault, he, on the one hand, signed agreements with it, and on the other hand, continued the violence. So it was a more subtle and more complex approach than had been the case, but it was only due, in my understanding, to these two huge blows that he'd undergone, losing the Soviet Union, losing Iraq. The Israeli side was a certain weariness with this unending conflict, and the ability of Peres and his aides to essentially pull a fast one on Rabin. Our journal, Middle East Quarterly, has a fine piece by Faim Karsh, who was quoted earlier, showing how odd this whole process was, how Rabin got sucked into something that he really was reluctant to do. The famous picture of him shaking hands with Arafat, shows him like this, doesn't want to be doing it. But he is responsible for making these terrible mistakes. And I'd add another one to them. I wrote a piece a few months ago suggesting that it should have been the second secretary of the Israeli embassy in Norway who signed that agreement with Arafat. If there had to be an agreement, it should have been the second secretary, not the prime minister. What is this? Prime minister and head of a goon head of a terrorist organization are parallel? What is this? This is obnoxious. So there were so many mistakes that Rabin made, but he made them with his eyes open and takes the full blunt of responsibility.
Studied Rabin, I refer you to my book of Rabin. But I think at the elite, labor elite, at the time of Oslo, there was a perception, I emphasize the word, perception that the Israeli society is tired. This is not true, but this was their perception. And for Rabin, this was significant, together with the two factors that Daniel mentioned, the destruction of the Soviet Union and the fall of Iraq, that he wanted to negotiate from a position of strength. So he believes this was, at that time, a strong position of Israel. Also, we had a very good relationship with the United States. And at the same time, this was complemented by this perception that the Israeli society maybe cannot take longer this conflict. So those two, contradictory, developments brought Rabin to the negotiate table, He was a pragmatist, by the way. He was willing eventually to talk to the PLO. He sent before that emissaries to the PLO. And Rabin, in '95, before he was murdered, was considering revoking the agreement because he was so disappointed with the results of Arafat. So, one of the generals in his biography, in his memoirs, he was chief of intelligence, and he told Rabin, those guys are not ready for peace, they are not preparing for peace, they are preparing for war. And this was probably in October '95, and Rabin at that time said, we'll wait for the elections at the beginning of '96, and then I'll decide what to do. And even Dalia Rabin, his daughter, admits that he was considering, revoking the agreement. Rabin was gingy, red hair, he was impulsive, and he could have, only he had the authority actually, in the Israeli political system to revoke the system, but he was murdered.
But Netanyahu ran in '96 on a platform that suggested he would revoke it. Why didn't he?
Netanyahu is a different story. Netanyahu is very cautious, maybe more cautious than I would have been. I would have advised him. And it was a very narrow victory. And I believe he didn't feel the legitimacy to revoke the agreement, and he went for the Hebron Agreement. He eventually went for a strategy, managing the conflict, and which to some extent is to minimize the international damage or whatever. At that time, it was very difficult for Israel to say, okay, the Palestinians are no partner. So I don't think he really could have managed it. And to this very day, he still pays some kind of lip service to the two-state solution. He made the speech as I'm patient. I don't push the president to come up with a plan. He's probably busy with other more important things. So that's all right. If a plan will come, of course, we'll hope that Palestinians would say no, and I think it's not the best result. Yeah. So, and we will say, if it comes into our lap, we'll say yes, but we'll put, 10, 15, 20 conditions, to improve the deal. And eventually it will peter out as all the other great, peace plans.
Ephraim talks from the wisdom of the ages. I have a different take. Actually, I gave a whole talk for Emmett a couple months ago on it. In brief, I see the US president as a deal maker, as a real estate guy. And when you're doing a big deal, you got to have the unions, the banks, the inspectors, the partners, all in on the deal, and you got to give each one something so it's happy. Same thing here. The goal is Iran. Confront Iran. That's the goal. You do it in part directly by ending the JCPOA, and in part by putting together an alliance in the Middle East. And that alliance is the Arab states and Israel. To do that, you want first to have the Arab states, foremost Saudi Arabia. So your very first trip abroad is to Saudi Arabia, and you sign deals for hundreds of billions of dollars for arms. You give the Saudis all they can possibly want. Then you turn to Israel and you say, okay, Israel, I'm going to give you your dream, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And then you turn to the Palestinians, because you want to have this deal done so that there'll be potential for Arab state-Israel cooperation. You say, the Palestinians, we recognize Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital. So, boom, A, B, C, you all got what you want. It's off the table. Let's go. And so I think the Israelis will be confronted with a plan that they will be demanded to accept. That was Trump's most recent phrasing of it, that he, not just that we're going to do it, but he wants the Israelis to do it. So he's going to demand of Israel that Israel accept, recognize Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital. And I think we're in for some real rough times ahead. It may well be demanded that the Palestinians recognize Israel, but where did that get us the last decades? Yeah, of course, I believe the Palestinians accept this. In contrast, I had, for example, a debate in print with Jonathan Tobin, who said, no problem, the Palestinians will reject it. I'm saying, no, the Palestinians will accept it. How are the Palestinians going to reject recognition of Palestine? That's their goal. So of course they're going to accept it. The fact that Abbas is refusing to listen and so forth, it's the strange dynamics of Palestinian politics. But I think sooner or later he or someone else will finally listen and will say, not bad. And of course, yeah, we'll remember in the mid-1990s, all that stuff about the changing the Palestinian charter. I go through all that again, and you never really understood what happened and who really had authority over it, and then end up in a complete jumble. There will be something similar. Yeah, they'll say yes, but then they won't do it.
Right. That Yigal Carmona gave me, from memory, before there was a memory, of the Palestinian vote, which had nothing to do with actually changing the charter. It had to do with deciding that they would form a committee and that they would someday convene. The members of the committee were never appointed, the meeting never convened, and Peter Jennings, then at World News Tonight, said they said it couldn't be done. The Palestinians had changed their charter. So,
I was editor of the Middle East Quarterly then, and I commissioned a paper from an international legal specialist on the ins and outs of Israel repudiating this accord, and the basic justification was it's not a state. You can do it. And it was written. It was all ready to roll. But then it became clear this was not a topic of any utility because Netanyahu accepted it. I think he could have then. His personality and disposition and close victory led him not to do that, but he could have them. I don't know now. Now the Palestinian, the PA, is threatening to disavow Oslo, to undo it, to collapse the PA. So it's more a Palestinian threat than an Israeli threat at this point. As Ephraim suggested, there is a working relationship between the Israeli security forces and the PA security forces on the West Bank. Most of it's Israeli, but from what I understand, the Israeli security forces are happy with this. They abominated Arafat, but they rather can get along with Abbas. This is an okay time in their view. They're not displeased. They would put heavy pressure on the Prime Minister not to do that.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I really advise you to read some of the brilliant works of these two scholars, and I think we should heed the lessons. The first lesson, I think, shows the victory of wishful thinking and hope over reality, and any of us that have been married understand this. Right? And but let's hope that when it comes to any demands and pressures on the state of Israel for further withdrawals, we will heed some of these lessons. Thank you very much.